Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm Nellie Szilagyi-Benedek, Deputy Director for Education and Programs here at the Jewish Museum. In the aftermath of October 7th, 2023, and all that followed, the Jewish Museum introduced a new series of talks featuring James S. Snyder, Helen Goldsmith Menschel Director, in conversation with artists, authors, and other cultural leaders and thinkers, exploring the role and relevance of art and culture during these challenging times. These talks offer a forum for dialogue and discourse for public audiences of diverse backgrounds and perspectives, all of whom nonetheless embrace the Jewish Museum setting as a venue for education and engagement. The director's talks are part of the Morris W. Offit Lecture Series, made possible by the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Foundation. We are extremely grateful for this support. Tonight, James Snyder will be in conversation with Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, a conversation sparked by a special display at the Jewish Museum of the oldest known archaeological evidence of the existence of the House of David, the Tel Dan Stele, which was on loan from the Israel Museum in Jerusalem from December 5th, 2024 through January 5th, 2025. In addition to discussing the history of and the narratives inspired by the land of Israel, they will discuss Rabbi Cosgrove's new book, For Such a Time as This, on Being Jewish Today, copies of which will be available for purchase and signing after the program. As Rabbi Cosgrove notes in his book, the phrase, "for such a time as this," is a quote from the biblical book of Esther, from the moment in the story when Mordecai asked Esther to take action and save the Jewish community of ancient Persia. This is an instance when Esther needs to make the decision to act, despite the fact that doing so will endanger her own life. In his book, Rabbi Cosgrove discusses the necessity of taking an active role in the face of turmoil and the challenges of doing so. At the Jewish Museum, we take action by presenting exhibitions and programs that illuminate the power of art and culture to address complex ideas and complicated realities. Our current exhibition, Draw Them In, Paint Them Out, focuses on the work of contemporary artist Trenton Doyle Hancock, responding to the art of the influential modernist painter Philip Guston, both confronting the ugliness of racism, anti-Semitism, and white supremacy through their images of the KKK. In March, we will be opening an exhibition titled The Book of Esther in the Age of Rembrandt, which foregrounds the Book of Esther's popularity in 17th century Holland and Esther herself as a source of inspiration for diverse communities. A few words about our guest speaker. Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, Senior Rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue, is a leading voice of American Jewry. Ordained in 1999 at the Jewish Theological Seminary, he earned a doctorate at the University of Chicago Divinity School and is a Senior Hartman Rabbinic Fellow. Rabbi Cosgrove sits on the Chancellor's Cabinet of the Jewish Theological Seminary and on the editorial board of Masorti, the new journal of conservative Judaism. An officer of the New York Board of Rabbis, he serves on the boards of UJA Federation of New York, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and Hillel at the University of Michigan. He is the host of Conversations with Cosgrove, a podcast featuring sermons, conversations, and selected programs. And as many of you know, most recently, Rabbi Cosgrove officiated at the lighting of the Hanukkah candles at the White House. We are all looking forward to the conversation tonight and appreciate your being here with us. I would like to remind everyone to please turn off your cell phones and refrain from recording or photographing during tonight's program. And now please join me in welcoming our speakers, James Snyder and Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove. Thank you.
Good evening to all of you. You know, it's just great being in this ballroom with you. Time and again this happens. It's like old home week to come in here. And you know, tonight just adds to the meaning of moments like this, because I have a feeling that among all of our guests this evening, having this opportunity to be here with Elliot, probably a great many of you are not just friends of this Jewish museum, but also members of Park Avenue Synagogue, as Tina and I are. So, you know, for me, it's always this thing about how all things connect across time and place. This is one of those moments, and it's really a great pleasure and a privilege to be here with Elliot, of course, but also with all of you. So thank you all for being here. It's a packed house, and that gives all of us here, we have several of our board members. Sherry Aronson, our chair, is here. It gives all of us a really strong and warm feeling to see such a robust moment as this is. So thank you all for coming, and welcome. Now, as Nellie mentioned, and I do need to take a moment, where is that Nellie? She always goes to hide after she introduces. She's in the very last seat in the very last row. Nellie and her team in our education program here are unbelievable. You've already heard a bit from her about our response after October 7, well over a year ago, and how these directors' talks are central to what the museum is doing. Time and again, this is a robust evening, a robust event, and Nellie and her team really make all of this happen. So Nellie, really, we need to give you some applause before we get underway. So as you know, our directors' talks did start last year, not long after October 7, as part of our action plan after the tragedy of that moment and all the events that unfolded afterward and alas are still unfolding today. We said then, almost immediately after October 7, that there was and continues to be a need to message, calling for the restoration of humanism and talking about the fundamental role of museums as custodians for the legacy of global cultural heritage. Without humanism, that legacy doesn't exist. We felt then, and we continue to feel, that we need to keep taking action. As a museum, it's a responsibility. As a museum, we hope that we stand as a forefront in that respect, demonstrating how we can be a platform for education and engagement, and how we can be a model for the kind of cultural diplomacy that just possibly might offer a pathway to a brighter time ahead. We all know that we are living, alas, in times of ignorance and polarization, and we need to do our best to be the antidote to the challenges presented by ignorance and polarization today. These directors' talks, this series, these talks really have been central to our program. We do, through these talks, look at the complexities of these times, but we don't talk politics, and we don't use that P word. We try always to look through a cultural lens, to talk to artists, writers, creative thinkers of all kinds, but really, for us, these talks aren't just about the arts. They're about education, they're about religion. And that is actually what makes this evening especially special. It is an honor and a privilege to have Elliot here with us. You heard from Nellie all about Elliot's history. In full disclosure, you need all to know, you probably already do know, that Elliot is Tina's and my rabbi. I would say not just our rabbi, he's been an amazing friend and a pastoral counselor in good times and in times less good. And tonight, really, having Elliot here couldn't be more special, because there's a kind of evolving narrative between the two of us about the roles not just of culture, but of culture and religion in moments like this. There's a resonance between the role of this museum in presenting and interpreting material culture, in helping our audiences understand history and today, And this is exactly Elliot's role as a religious leader at Park Avenue Synagogue. So our agendas are resonant. And beyond this point, Elliot is a major voice on behalf of the American Jewish community, not just 87th Street and Madison Avenue. Nellie mentioned that Elliot was at the White House to officiate for this year's candlelighting service for Hanukkah with President Biden. And that is actually the reason why at the last moment we had to move our date for this evening from December 16 till tonight. We wanted to do this talk while the Tel Dan Stele was still with us, because in a way, the Stele has become a touchstone for the conversation that continues to be between the two of us. We hope you all saw the Stele when it was here. We are certainly going to talk about it this evening. You know, I do always repeat this mantra that all things do connect across time and around the globe. For us at this very moment, there's a kind of serendipity having this conversation, given projects we've just presented and projects that are just coming, and given Elliot's new book, For Such a Time as This. And the connection between what we have done recently here, like the Tel Dan Stele, and what we're about to do, like our Book of Esther, Age of Rembrandt exhibition, gives a special resonance to our being here together this evening. So there's a lot on our plate for this talk. Now, I do want to start with the Tel Dan Stele. As Nellie mentioned, it is the oldest archaeological evidence of the existence of the House of David. It is therefore, you're seeing it behind us, you're going to see it all through our talk. It is central to the First Temple narrative, and it is exactly the earliest example of this kind of intersection between the reality of archaeology and the metaphor and the mythology of the Bible. It is also, because of its reference to the House of David, foundational to the notion of the common source of heritage and legacy, not just for Judaism, but Judaism, Christianity, and Islam together. From the time of its inscription in around 900 BC, throughout the 1500 years that would follow. Why did we want to bring the Stele here just now? Because we wanted to make this point about the resonance among monotheistic cultures. We wanted to make the point that Jewish culture doesn't stand apart, that it relates to other cultures, and for us, bringing it here added additional meaning just now. So, Elliot, when I talk about the Stele, first of all, you know this, I never know exactly how to pronounce it, and most people, when I do say Stele, don't know what I'm talking about, so I say Stele is an analog Instagram. But you know much more about this, so let's start by having you talk about the Stele and its importance.
James, thank you so much for the warm and gracious welcome. Thank you to the Jewish Museum for the warm and gracious welcome. I only walked a few blocks from my synagogue on 87th and Madison, many of your synagogue on 87th and Madison, but we are really partner institutions, a personal friendship, an institutional friendship, and it is a pleasure to be in your sanctuary here, and always a pleasure to see you and Tina in our shared sanctuary at the synagogue. I will frame it, at the moment I discovered that the Tel Dan Stele was being housed here for that brief period of time, I made a point not just that the adults in my community would have the opportunity, and you greeted everyone so warmly, but also the teens in my community and the youth were able to come here, and we spent a Saturday afternoon and we had an entire event to see the earliest attestation of Beit David, the House of David. We live in a time, some people might call it a post-truth era, a question where claims and counterclaims are happening independent of the facts at hand, and I operate in the world of words, of Talmud, of Bible, and otherwise, but to actually have a physical artifact that is an extra biblical attestation, right? It's one thing if the Hebrew Bible, internal to it, says that something called the House of David existed, but to actually have something that is physical, that you can touch, that you can see, that you can actually have evidence, archaeologically speaking, that predates any contemporary polemic right now over, who can make what claim to the land, that there was a House of David in conversations as they relate to claims of indigeneity and otherwise. It's not just being a nerd with this intrigue of archaeology, but as a rabbi who has a sense of Jewishness, whose center is in the land of Israel, this is a critically important building block in establishing that claim to the land.
Of course, the point here is to make the connection between the meaning historically, archaeologically and historically of this object, and fast forwarding to the conundra of today and the challenges that we all wrestle with thinking about Israel, the land of Israel, the state of Israel. Does it add special meaning for you to be looking at this object, reading its inscription? Actually, tell everyone what it says. Now, it's
Well, the significance is it's actually describing a great defeat by the hands of Israel's enemy in the 9th century before the Common Era. And so this is not some sort of glory being, this would be something that would have been much easier to shove under the rug. But this is actually describing a moment of loss, yet another moment, or one of the earliest moments. There's also the Menschel Stele in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. There are a few of these objects. In the Louvre, there's a stela. These are attestations of conquering kings saying Israel's seed is wiped out, Israel is no more. So it's a spiritual message that in the face of loss, the Jews have extended well beyond what anyone predicted their shelf life to be. A great historian, Simon Ravidovich, once wrote an essay on Israel, the ever-dying people, that at every juncture of Jewish history, they've said, that's the end of the story, and at every juncture of Jewish history, a new generation of Jews have risen up to bridge the generations, lador vador, from generation to generation. So this is probably the first chapter of that story through the millennia.
A few points here. There is a handful of other archaeological fragments that refer to the House of David. Amazingly, they are only in 3 venues. This is at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The British Museum and the Louvre hold the others. And just in the quiet of this room, I'll let you all know that we're thinking that it would be pretty extraordinary to bring all of them together at some point here. It hasn't happened before, but it would be remarkable to do so and not necessarily so difficult. So keep that to yourselves. Keep that under your kippah. But we are thinking about doing this. And Elliot said about objects and words. And it's interesting, this is part of the continuing conversation between us. Words have deep meaning, objects have deep meaning, and when you pull them together, it's that much more powerful. So, the story here is about some Mesopotamian king boasting that he's defeated the kingdoms of Israel in the north, Judah in the south, Judah being the house of David. That's what it says here. Not long after this was written, inscribed, of course, there was another defeat. That guy got defeated, and somebody destroyed the stele, which is why you're only seeing 3 fragments that went into secondary use not long after this first inscription. So it's like good times come and go, bad times come and go. Also, there's, I think, a discrepancy between what is written here and in detail what is in the Bible. So it's like this notion that even though this is physical, maybe this is fake news. Could this have been fake news?
No, I actually think the fact that there's a variant between that it's not just a carbon copy rendition of what the biblical account is, actually is an argument for its authenticity. That by showing sort of the rough edges between the archaeological evidence, it would almost be too neat and tidy if everything aligned sort of perfectly. Then I'd get very nervous and say, wait a second, maybe something fishy is going on. But here, I think the rough edges are a proof text towards its authenticity.
You know, we didn't rehearse this point, but you're exactly to the point here, because it might have been that from a narrative, an oral narrative, this was written subsequent to an oral narrative, and chances are it's the other way around. So, you know, this is looking at the stele from 900 BCE. So really, fast forward to the current moment. What are your thoughts? How does it make you feel thinking about our thoughts about the Holy Land, the land of Israel, the state of Israel today, and what we are all wrestling with at the moment after October 7 and everything that's happened since then?
Yeah, well, I know you preceded or introduced the program by talking about your aversion to speaking about politics. So I will speak about politics, and you can just nod your head and stay apolitical. But
we didn't rehearse this either, but some of you have been to these talks, and this is exactly how we do it. I don't use the P word, but I talk to someone who does.
So I actually just returned from Israel on Friday. Those of you who have been in my community know that I try to have a very balanced view. This was a dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians. I believe that there are claims and there are counterclaims, but whatever the adage is, that everyone's entitled to their opinion, but you're not entitled to your facts. And what was very there was a real sense of disillusionment that it's not just on college campuses, but it's in Israel itself, between the various sides, as it's not just a question of two communities laying claim to the same piece of real estate, but it's actually whether or not Jews have a claim to that piece of real estate is in question, and whether the entire Zionist project is simply the latest expression of colonialism. And I don't need to rehearse the entire argument, but that is what's going on in popular culture. That's what's going on college campuses. That's certainly going on in the Palestinian community. And I think, just to reveal my own politics are such as, how do you figure out a way that two people with competing claims to the same land can figure out a way to all hang their hat in peace in shared society, one next to the other? You might agree with that or disagree with that. I'm just putting my cards out on the table. The reason this is so important and things like this are so important, because it is clear, demonstrative proof that the Jewish claim to the land long preceded World War II, long preceded the first waves of Aliyah, of emigration, long preceded Theodore Herzl, long preceded the years of exile, that you can go back to the First Temple, the Second Temple, and you can actually see that there is a historical claim. That doesn't get us out of the pickle of the present, but it simply reveals the fraud of assigning some sort of colonial agenda to the project of Zionism. Zionism is defined as the Jewish claim to the Jews' indigenous homeland, historic homeland.
And you know, that wasn't very political. That was philosophical and much appreciated. You know, a point here is also that this is it's a touchstone for what becomes a continuum, the sort of evolving formation of the monotheistic faiths, first of Judaism, then of Christianity, and then of Islam. And if you do come to the present moment, exactly why we do what we do here in the museum is to underscore the point that there is a connection. There is a connection among cultures and faiths. And it's not as if they are segregated and separate. It is that you can find ways to move from one to the next over time. And starting with something as old as this makes that possible in important ways. What I want to do now, though, is bring us forward to your book. And, you know, it was clearly quite important for you to do this book just now, to do it now. I mean, your subtitle is On Being Jewish Today. And, you know, we are all struggling with the challenge of spiritual identity and cultural assimilation in the moment. A lot of your book focuses on this, and we're going to move. I want to talk about this a bit first, come back to it, and in between, talk about the Queen Esther story. But first, I want to begin with your talking for a moment about your motivation in doing the book.
So I've long wanted to write a book. It took an inspiring book agent who's sitting in this room, Jennifer Weissmansky, to actually get me to actually do it. And I thank you, Jennifer, for leading the way. And it was an opportunity for me to take a lot of ideas that I had been thinking through over the years that many of them have heard from the pulpit, but prompted by the trauma of October 7th, and a time to say, how did we arrive where we are? Where are we right now in the wake of October 7th? And some preliminary thoughts on where we can go into the future. I actually begin the book talking exactly about things that you have made your career on, which are the lines between our secular identities and our Jewish identity, and where the Jewish starts and where it stops vis-a-vis the broader cultural context in which we live in. So I use the image of the hyphen of the Jewish American identity. This moment in time that I grew up in, I imagine many people in this room grew up in it, where we believed ourselves to comfortably exist as denizens of both cultures, of both a Jewish world and a non-Jewish world, and the promise of American life, right? There was that cultural image of the melting pot that we would all be thrown in, and our differences would be elided into one emergent American identity. But the contrary image by American Jewish intellectual Horace Callan was, no, the goal of America is not to be a melting pot, to be a symphony where different identities could play their own timbre and tonality of their instrument, and that's what makes America America, that we are celebrating the symphony of American diverse cultural life. That was the dream. That is a dream, that we could live comfortably, and October 7th was this wake-up call. That maybe it ain't so. Maybe this sense of being at homeness was an anomaly of the last 70 years, and this emergence, not just the horrific attacks of October 7th, but that sense of trauma that maybe America isn't as hospitable to a Jewish presence as we may have had ourselves believe. And so the story is really that story of the shock, the trauma, the whiplash of October 7th, and the identity of Jewish assertion that has emerged from that. I can get to the Esther, but I suspect Esther is going to be a question you're going to ask.
Right. Don't go to Esther yet, because
Okay.
I want to stay with this for a moment, because, you know, there is the Bible. Come to the present, there is the geopolitical reality of the moment that we live in. But there are also opportunities for writing. There are opportunities in literature. There are opportunities in the arts. We spoke when we were talking about what we might discuss tonight about Tom Stoppard's Leopoldstadt. Did everyone in the room see Leopoldstadt? I'm sure you all did. When Tina and I went to see it, as we were walking there, I said to her, is everyone in the theater going to be from Park Avenue Synagogue? And, you know, there were a few of you were there. But what was most interesting to us was to see how representatives of so many other cultures were there. You know, there were Latin Americans, African Americans, there were all people of all Asians, every kind of culture was there, because this isn't just a challenge for the Jewish people. You know, it's this notion of cultural identity or spiritual or religious identity on the one hand, and then the aspiration to cultural assimilation. And, you know, all it takes, and there can be the fiction, as in Leopoldstadt, that you've accomplished that, but all it takes is a political moment that pulls the rug out from under you, and you realize that the notion of a melting pot is just aspirational. And maybe at best it's a colloidal suspension, but colloidal suspensions also separate at a certain moment.
But I think this is a critical point, and maybe a recurring point, as you say. I mean, we can go all the way back because I'm a rabbi, this week's Torah reading, where Joseph thought that in Egypt, right, he looked like an Egyptian, he talked like an Egyptian, as the song goes, he walked like an Egyptian, and that the things were going to go well. And what's the very first line of this week's Torah reading? Vayakam melech, not the first line, but the first few lines. Vayakam melech hadash asher lo yada Yosef, that a new king arose who did not know Joseph. So this sense of being at home in the diaspora Jewish community, there was a wake-up call. If you look at the story of Esther, which we will get to when you decide it's time to get there, that the story of Esther, that Esther thought that things were good. If you look at Leopoldstadt, then that was a moment of pre-war Germany where the Jewish community believed themselves to be the anomaly of Jewish history, that they were going to be safe, that they were going to successfully assimilate into German culture while retaining their, you know, Jewish bona fides, perhaps not. And then, of course, everything comes crashing down. And then you have American Jewry in this moment of time. The great Zionist thinker Achad Ha'am had this image of two kinds of assimilation. It was actually Gershon Cohen, a former chancellor of the seminary, who wrote a famous essay based on Achad Ha'am called The Blessings of Assimilation. And what he meant to say by that is certain forms, I'd be fascinated, James, to know what you think about this in the context of art, but certain forms of cultural assimilation are good. Right, that if you hear a new melody in synagogue that revitalizes something that brings an old liturgy anew, you say, thank you for assimilating an element of Broadway into my Shabbat morning service, perhaps at some hypothetical synagogue that you know. But if you, so that might be a positive form of cultural assimilation, but there is also a negative form of cultural assimilation, which Achad Ha'am wrote about, which is when the sort of the Jewishness of the art, of the music, of the culture erodes into the broader cultural context and loses its distinctive Jewish imprimatur. And so and this goes directly to a question of, right, at what point is it Jewish art, not Jewish art, right? These are fascinating questions that I don't know which way the interview's going right now, but I'm sure you've thought about these questions.
Well, we think about this quite a lot. You know, not to go there, but I'm going to go there for a moment. My background is in modern art and architectural history, 1850 to the present. I didn't think about all this stuff about, you know, global cultural resonance, the mosaic of global cultural identities until I went to Israel. We got to the Israel Museum and it unlocked for me the 1.5 million years of material culture documenting exactly what you're describing. All of these cultures that live at any moment in time, at any place in the world, that can and should resonate with one another. So it's not that you want to become one another, it's that you want resonance. And that resonance produces an incredible kind of texture that can have meaning at many different times throughout history. The problem is that unless you surface that narrative of texture across time, everybody forgets it, and that's when you have these moments of awakening. And that really is an important point. So now let's come to the Esther Scroll story and to how your book connects to it. Of course, your title relates to Mordechai's declaration to Esther at the beginning of chapter 4 of the Esther Scroll. Read that statement to us.
So that's where the title comes from, for such a time as this. So this is a moment in time where the chips are down. Esther literally physically assimilates into the household of King Ahasuerus. And she believed that it was all going to work out until, of course, Haman's wicked decree comes down and the fate of the Jewish people is on the line. And Mordechai, by way of an emissary, sends a message to Esther ensconced in the royal palace and says, "Do not imagine that you, of all Jews, will escape with your life in the king's palace." And she continues, and he continues to Esther, "And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal position for such a time as this." And so that moment, that speech, that charge by Mordechai to his niece Esther creates what I call an Esther moment. And Esther rises up as a woman, as a queen, and most of all as a Jew, and she saves the day, and the Jewish people are saved. And that story is, I also think, one of the subplots of the American Jewish community and us all. It wasn't just the American Jewish community. In Israel, those who were fighting most fiercely against the judicial reform became the greatest organizers and volunteers on behalf of those traumatized. They had their Esther moment. I had my Esther moment, perhaps by raising a lot of money or writing a book or becoming a public advocate on behalf of the people and the state of Israel in the face of their attackers, but also in the face of the onslaught of the anti-Semitism that began on October 8th as well in the States. Many of us, as volunteers, as philanthropists, as advocates, as water cooler conversations, have become Esthers on our own right. And this positive assertion that we're traumatized but we're not paralyzed in the face of what's happened, I think has really been one of the inspiring dimensions of this terrible time of Jewish history.
And you know, this point is relevant for all of us. Each of us has had his or her Esther moment. Each of us has that moment when, you know, like when God talked to Moses through the burning bush, and it makes you, it precipitates decision making. Maybe that's why Elliot became a rabbi. Maybe that's why I became a museum director. Maybe that's why when members of the search committee here at the Jewish Museum a year and a half ago, long after I had thought that I was finished being a museum director, called me, and I knew that I needed to come here and be director of the Jewish Museum, a position I took on 3 weeks before October 7. And it just sets the stage for what you do thereafter. In our case in the museum, it really set the stage for the plan that we've been implementing over the last year and a half. For you, it has had a lot to do with the messages you deliver from Park Avenue Synagogue, but also for your decision to do the book.
Yeah, and by the way, it's not a one-trick pony. I think art has been a vehicle to bring people together who would otherwise not sit at the same table and talk politics. Your Esther moment, it's not my place to tell you how to run your museum, but you're right, a museum can serve as a meeting ground for people from a diversity of backgrounds in a way that, say, an advocacy organization may not be able to play that same role. And so an Esther moment doth not mean that you speak with the loudest voice advocating one position or the other, your Esther moment might be the meeting ground for people who otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity. Last week, I was in Israel. It was a thoroughly depressing trip, really a place of hopelessness. Just before this event, James and I were checking the news. Please God, the hostages should be released soon. But the only place that I felt any hope, I don't know if you're familiar with this place, it's called the Feel Bait Art Colony or something like that, a meeting ground where Palestinians and Israelis who would otherwise have nothing to say to each other, whose narratives are clashing one with the other, are sitting there because art gives them a vehicle of expression that words and politics does not. And that was the only place where I actively saw Israelis and Palestinians sitting around in community together with art.
You know, Feel Bet was one of many places in Jerusalem that before October 7 provided opportunities to discover exactly this kind of interchange through the visual and performing arts. Today, it's just about the only one that's continuing to edge its way forward. But so this brings, God works in mysterious ways. This brings us to our Book of Esther, Age of Rembrandt exhibition that is opening here on March 4th, which is exactly about Esther and her iconic stature in 17th century Netherlands. This was a time when the Netherlands was emerging from the oppression of Spanish rule, and Esther stood out as a kind of icon for heroism, for the stature that Elliot has already described, the stature that we all know Esther to have represented in so many ways. And our exhibition is going to be about the demonstration of sacred and secular artisanship that interpreted and was inspired by the geopolitical moment of the Netherlands in the 17th century. Not just Rembrandt, not just the painters that were with Rembrandt, but in many artistic mediums, and the material is stunning. You're going to have to come and enjoy the exhibition, and it's actually about this resonance and the opportunity that artisanship, that art and culture can provide for getting past the challenges of a moment. Now, looking at Elliot's book, he speaks often about the mosaic of Jewish cultures that exist across the global landscape that don't often recognize one another as part of the same story. And here in our museum, and some of you know this from me as well, at the moment we're redoing our collection galleries on the 3rd and 4th floors, and that story, the new story there, is going to be about 3,500 years of Jewish material culture wandering through and representing resonance with cultures around the globe and across time. This notion of the recognition of other cultures, this notion of influencing and being influenced by other cultures. For me, this might seem, and perhaps our exhibition will demonstrate this in a way, the opportunity to get past what is going on today, this xenophobia, this anti-Semitism that we're experiencing after October 7. Am I being characteristically overly optimistic in thinking in these terms?
Okay, let's get to optimism in a moment. I just want to focus on 17th century Amsterdam for a moment, because I was thinking about this in anticipation of this. I think it's everything you just said and more, because Rembrandt was living in Amsterdam, which was the same Amsterdam and same place and time as Spinoza, as Manasseh ben Israel. This was a post-Inquisition Jewish communities who had hidden their identities in the face of oppression, had migrated to form new communities in Amsterdam. The whole drama surrounding Spinoza as to where the boundaries are, was he Baruch Spinoza, was he Benedict Spinoza? And I don't think, though I'm way beyond my pay grade right now, that it's a coincidence that the figure of Esther, a woman who had hidden her Jewish identity and emerged from that Jewish identity, that was the subject matter of Rembrandt, who had known relationships with members of the Jewish community in Amsterdam at that time, should have chosen, right, I believe one of the pieces of art is a biblical heroine, that's one of the Rembrandts that's going to be here, and I don't think not even you, James Snyder, can open up Putin's hands to the Hermitage collection, but if anyone could, you could. But the famous scene of Rembrandt's depiction of Achashverosh, Haman, and Esther around the table together, that would be the subject matter that so intrigued Rembrandt, these borderline issues of Jewish identity in 17th century Amsterdam.
And you know, with Rembrandt, it really was specifically about cross-cultural reference. Many of the sitters for his portraits were Jewish people in Amsterdam. Whether they were depicting Jews or not, they were Jewish people. And you can identify them. You can see how, at the Israel Museum is Rembrandt's 1632 St. Peter mourning the betrayal of Christ. And the sitter for that portrait was a Jewish man. So St. Peter is depicted by a Jewish man. In the next year, Rembrandt paints the same sitter as Jeremiah lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem. For him, this notion of cross-cultural reference was very important. And the notion of identifying Esther's heroism, her iconic stature as a heroic figure, with what was happening in the Netherlands during that time was very important for him. And this really speaks to this notion, and you know, I am a pathological optimist, but this notion that the more you can get people to look at this sense of resonance rather than segregation, the more you can hope to find a brighter way. And your book speaks to this.
Look, I think this is the secret sauce of Jewish identity through the ages. And actually, it's not so much a political treatise, the book. The biggest chapter on politics I have are my thoughts about a future of a two-state solution or not a two-state solution, which is, you know, to say the word two-state solution, Palestinian or democracy in Israel, right? The Israeli left is dead right now. There was such a sense of betrayal, not to mention, of course, what's going on in Gaza right now, but the two sides are just not speaking to each other right now. So the question that I'm literally 2 days later coming back from Israel thinking about is, where is the hope? What is the road forward? And what's the role of American Jewry in a moment like this, where we are in the bleachers of a political military drama that we are not, we care deeply about, but we're not actually there voting, sending our children into the military or otherwise. And I do believe that we need to plant the seeds towards a vision which we may or may not enjoy the fruits immediately or perhaps even in our lifetime, but we nevertheless have to be a people of hope and a people of looking to operationalize that hope. I mean, that has been the story of our people since the very get-go. Moses went towards the promised land, whether or not he was going to reach it or not. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the prophets longed for a return to the land, whether or not they were going to resettle it. For thousands of years, Jews looked to a return to the land next year in Jerusalem, hoping for an outcome, whether or not it was realized. I think there's nothing wrong. I actually think there's everything right and everything Jewish about looking towards creating something prophetically and being participants and partners in that outcome, whether or not it is something to be yielded in the immediate term.
And then there is also the question, we all read so much about this notion of being a Jew outside of Israel today and being a Jew in Israel. And that question is not just for us, it's for all cultures who are wandering in the global diaspora. And you have to think about, if you are distant, can you also be engaged with something that's far away? And I want to come to a recent story which has to do with the arts, which also has to do with a figure who may be as heroic as Esther, and we'll go there. I'm sure some of you may have gone to the Venice Biennale this past year. I'm sure many of you read about it. You read the story about the Israel Pavilion and the push after October 7 to shut down the pavilion, and the decision of the Italian government to have the pavilion move ahead as planned. The artist was Ruth Patir. Her project, called Motherland, was before October 7. Her project was entirely about the notion of the plight of women from ancient times to the present, struggling with fertility. And her inspiration was these fertility goddesses that were 3,000 years old, that were all over the Middle East, that were amulets for fertility. Before October 7, her idea was brilliant, and her concept took something that was so rooted in the ancient Holy Land, but which had meaning, a universal meaning for women all over the world. After October 7, her concern was that this was going to become instead a very specific political message about issues of gender today, issues of the state of Israel. And Ruth Patir, the artist, made the decision not to open her pavilion out of concern that if she did, it might be destroyed, or her message might be co-opted by the political agenda and political messages of others. And for us in the art world, what she did was an act of heroism, because it was really a definitional example of activism through art. And of course, a nice part of that story is that we at the Jewish Museum in New York, toward the end of the Biennale, made a trip to Venice to see the Biennale, and particularly to spend time with Ruth Patir and to understand what her project's intention had been, and the decision that she made so as to preserve her intention and not have it be co-opted geopolitically by others. We saw it, our group was inspired, and I think you all read the full-page article in the New York Times that described with pride how the Jewish Museum in New York was acquiring Ruth Patir's project, would premiere it in Israel because it was of the Israel Pavilion, take it elsewhere, and then bring it home to its new home at the Jewish Museum in New York. Our objective being not only to preserve, but to provide an opportunity to showcase what her intention had been, to relate to a universal challenge facing women over the last 3,000 years. For us, this was an example of how we, in our world here, can engage productively with the challenges being faced in Israel. What's your take on that?
No, I think I can't wait. Kudos to the Jewish Museum. I think the intrigue for me about the Patir exhibit is its focus on and championing of the women's experience in this. I was just in Israel, and when we were meeting with would-be dialogue partners, and we said, what's wrong? Why is there such a vacuum of leadership on both the Israeli and Palestinian side? One of the participants said, well, the first problem is that in the boys' club of the Middle East, it's a bunch of men making all the decisions. And they said, if we wanted to bring about peace, then the men should just step aside, because if you've brought someone into this world in the biological sense, then you look at the world through fundamentally different eyes in a generational sense, and you're not making sort of these machismo male positioning things that men are wont to do, but you can actually put women in the driver's seat and we'll get the outcomes we want. And I was like, okay, men have screwed it up for the last few thousand years. Let's give women a chance to try to, figure out how to have self-determination of the Jews and the Palestinians side by side. I think we meaning men have successfully demonstrated that we have no competency in this. And so I actually think Patir, by championing both the trauma but also the possibility of the women's experience, I think this is going to be a very important addition to, and hopeful, please God, to the conversation.
And you are exactly to the point. This was her message, and she understood that it would be co-opted by the geopolitical impulses of the moment, and her message would have been destroyed. And our initiative here, and it was amazing. We took a group of friends of the museum. Sherry was with us. There were 20 of them, and when we finished our time with Ruth Patir, one of them said, why don't we all buy this together and keep it alive? And that's exactly what happened. And really, for us, it is that creative making today can be a pathway to a different way of looking at all of these challenges. And what you've just described is exactly to the point. Now, we're going to wrap up soon, but I have really 2 more questions for you. Thinking about your book, now that now that your book is out and about, what is your hope for how this message can change the story? Do you feel in any way that it...
Yeah, I want to bring one specific dimension of this book that we haven't talked about, which is the inter or cross-generational dimension of this. This book, please buy it, help the algorithm, make my book agent happy. But what really I hope there's something deeply personal about this book. I'm the father of 4 college-age or thereabout kids, and what they're experiencing on college campus of how they can reconcile their love of Israel, their kids of rabbis, their products of Jewish day school, Jewish camp, grew up in a synagogue, and they are in progressive college campuses, and they are caught in the crosshairs of a much bigger cultural debate of how to balance that tension. And so what I would like this book to be remembered as, if I could say such a thing, is that it's a book that could, not that you'll agree with it or that you'll disagree with it, but that it gives a language by which the generations can speak one to the other of how does one have vigilance for Jewish concern, but also empathy for the other. How does one fight the fight of Israel's right to self-determination, that October 7th will never happen again, and also find the language by which Palestinians too have a right to self-determination and safety and a homeland. The world it's the extremes who are speaking with the loudest megaphones on both sides. And I think that what really needs to happen is the rise of a sane center that rejects the binaries of the moment and actually creates a conversation that the generations can speak one to the other. And so that is really the charge of this book, that we have to learn. The Jewish people don't lack for enemies externally. We should stop making them internal, one to the other. We need to find a vocabulary that we can speak to each other in all of our intergenerational right-left political differences.
Elliot, thank you for that point. What I exactly wanted to conclude by asking you to say something like that, and to respond by saying that as I read your book, I felt that exactly you were trying also to reach to a next generation and to make the point that conversation, not complacency, is the way to understand who you are and where you are. And you know, this conversation is exactly a part of the kinds of conversations that need to be inspired by what you do and what we do. And this is where there is yet another resonance between us. And I just want to thank you for having this conversation, for being with us, for having our shared community be here with us this evening, and a pleasure to be here all together. Oops. For the benefit of Elliot's agent, I do need to say that he will be signing books up here to my right, if you would like to come up, and also if you would like to talk to the two of us, we're here.